Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Naomi doesn't want Bill to hurt Danny, and so she begins to stitch together a plan that will test her loyalties, her patience, and the brittle architecture of the family she thought she knew. It starts, as these things often do, with a moment of terrible clarity, Naomi walking into a small, dim living room and seeing Haley on the floor, emptied out, trembling with an absence that seemed to have taken everything except for the sound of her own breath. Chelsea had been taken, the world had narrowed to that jagged piece of missing light, and Bill, Naomi's father, had left as if the crisis belonged to someone else. Naomi watched Haley in that ruined state and felt something hot and unnameable bloom in her chest. An instinctive flare that was less about pity than about a vow. Haley's misery was a thing that had weight. Naomi could describe the way her shoulders collapsed, the way her voice worked without making sound, the way she kept holding out hope like a hand stretched into void. She had been left in the cold by a man who swore he would protect, abandoned while a child was stolen. That abandonment lodged in Naomi as an accusation not just against Bill but against an entire family mythology. The story of Bill as unshakable, Bill as the island in a storm. Naomi had been raised on that myth, but myths erode where flesh learns to count failure. So when Naomi later found herself moving in ways that would look like treachery to some, she would remember that night and the way Haley's fingers had left faint crescents in the worn rug where she had curled up. Naomi had reasons to keep her distance. Haley and Naomi were not friends, at least not in the way anyone would call friendship. There had been polite gestures at parties, the kind of surface slick smiles you give to people who share your life but not your inner sanctum. Naomi had watched Haley from the narrow theater of observation that teenagers learn to inhabit, on the edges, looking in. She had no desire to be the confidant of someone who had been wronged and then, in the thing that hurt most, abandoned. Yet when Naomi saw Haley, ruined and suddenly so precise in her suffering, the reflex that moved her was not fury at Bill but the soft, focused care that comes unsolicited to young women who cannot tolerate the sight of other women's pain. Naomi's first impulse was to flee, to pretend she had an errand, to hold the neat, civilized line that kept her from messy involvement, and she did walk away. She told herself she left because she didn't know what to say. That was true. It was also an elegant lie she kept for self-preservation. Naomi left the gathering with a mouthful of excuses and the quiet, scandal-proofed explanation that she needed air. Sometimes the easiest way to refuse involvement is to cloak the refusal in the language of need. She wanted to say something to Haley, or she wanted not to say something. Sometimes it is a love and sometimes it is something colder that pushes you toward interference. A moral certainty that grants permission to arrange outcomes for others. Naomi chose the middle path, absence followed by a strategy. She would not speak to Haley in that messy, healing way. Instead she would help her manipulate Bill. That detail, the decision to help Haley lure Bill, is worth dwelling on because it reveals Naomi's double-edged nature. She was acting out of an old-fashioned, almost Victorian sense of guardianship. But the instrument she chose was deception. To lure Bill is to appeal to his appetite for attention, for ego, for the kinds of adulations that can be mistaken for love. Naomi understood Bill's weaknesses in a way others sometimes did not: his need to be desired, to be the center, to be the rescuer even when rescue was misapplied. Naomi intended to weaponize those needs not for revenge but for prevention. She did not want Bill to do to Danny what he had done to Haley. She believed there could be a future in which Bill, baited into a confession, would either be shamed into restraint or exposed in such a way that Danny would never be left in the orbit of his indecision. Helping Haley lure Bill was not simply a tactical choice. It was an intimate betrayal of the code Naomi had always observed, the quiet family rule that one did not pull at the threads of another person's romantic life simply for sport. Yet Naomi convinced herself that his was not sport. She was protecting someone she loved. Danny had been Bill's great, slow ache. She had been the woman Naomi suspected of holding him to some softer, older standard. Naomi loved Danny not in a possessive sense but in a kin consciousness. Danny had been good to Naomi in small ways, had been generous with the kind of attention that feels like shelter. Naomi could imagine Danny being hurt the way Haley had been hurt, and the image would not leave her. Naomi's counsel to Haley, the blunt, familial adjacent imperative to hold tight to your husband, seemed on its face like odd counsel for someone trying to encourage a woman to lure another man. But Naomi's approach was a crooked logic that worked like this: if Haley maintained an unshakable public commitment to her husband, Bill would have to work harder, he would have to be more open about what he wanted. Or perhaps he would be humiliated, perhaps, seeing Haley committed, he would be forced to choose or to expose his choices in a way that made them unbearable. Naomi imagined scenarios where devotion operated as an irritant, a mirror held up to Bill so that he could see what his indecisions meant to someone else. This was the psychology of entrapment masquerading as advice: keep who you have, because clarity is cruelty only to those who are cowardly. The mechanics of Naomi's plan were the small, petty things a strategist loves: suggestive posts that looked innocent, invitations sent to the wrong person on purpose, a carefully worded comment at a fundraiser that would have Bill wanting to explain himself. Naomi wasn't the kind to stage overt, operatic trap scenes. She preferred the literature of suggestion, the way a single glance in the right place could light an old ember. She taught Haley to wear something that recalled a memory Bill had of her, to linger at events where Bill would expect to find someone else entirely, to let Bill overhear a conversation that would make his instincts rise like a tide. These were manipulations Naomi justified with an almost surgical cool. They were for protection. It's a slippery logic: protection via deception, and yet Naomi followed it because she believed mistakes could be stopped with quick hands. Naomi was not naive about what any of this might cost. She understood that playing on someone's feelings could both save and ruin. She understood that a plan built of insinuation could combust into real heartbreak. It was part of the discomfort that tightened around Naomi, part of the sacrifice she was willing to make because the alternative inaction felt like complicity. We forgive ourselves for many things when we can say they were done for love. She did not speak to Haley about this at the outset. Naomi's first encounters with Haley after that night were indirect, satin-slick exchanges at fundraisers and community events, the kind of interactions that could hide the worst intentions behind smiles. Naomi pretended to be busy at the end of the bar, asked Haley to hold her a coat, texted her later with a recipe that had nothing to do with what she wanted. The plan required synthesis, and Naomi's surface calm was a kind of crucible in which she could refine it. At the same time, Naomi watched her parents. There, in the background of all these manipulations, something else happened that cut at her like a knife. She caught Bill with his hands at the small of another woman's waist one afternoon, not in a demonstrative way, not with the kind of public intimacy that gets photographs and gossip pages, but in a private space where two people allowed themselves to seem soft. The sight stung her not because she felt betrayed by her father in the way a lover might feel betrayed, but because the intimacy made everything more precarious. If Bill could be gentle in public with someone else, if he could be physically near and emotionally absent while a child was taken, if he could do that once, then he might do it again. Naomi wanted to stop that pattern. That intimacy she saw was complicated. There were reasons people rediscover one another in later life. Loneliness is a conspiring, sympathetic force. Naomi's mother had her own strategies for survival and might have sought solace where most daughters would least like to see it found. Naomi recognized the shapes of marriage that had become accommodations rather than arcs, routines uneventful. Kindness is given out of habit more than passion, and yet sometimes there were flashes of tenderness that made Naomi want to believe in people again. When she saw those flashes, she felt as if an ember had been fed, and that made action necessary because embers spread. And so Naomi, with her private moral calculus, decided she could not stay silent. She approached Haley privately at the florist shop where Haley worked for a piece of a morning and, in a voice that was small and urgent, told her the blunt truth: keep tight to your husband. Naomi ran the words like a tourniquet against possibility. There was a hardness to the sentence that allowed no room for romantic interpretation. Hold your husband, Naomi said, as if the survival of certain affections depended on the exactitude of this counsel. It was both a warning and a tool. The warning had a double edge. Naomi didn't only warn Haley about Bill's capacity for leaving. She performed a ritual of admonition toward her father as well. Naomi confronted Bill in a public corridor one night, the glitter of the fundraiser shedding like sloughed scales as she demanded, with the seriousness of someone speaking on behalf of another, that he stop toying with Danny's feelings. The incongruity of a daughter scolding a man who had navigated elections and committees was not lost on either of them. Naomi's voice trembled with more than filial anger. She wanted to be persuasive but not accusatory in a way that made Bill defensive. It wasn't that she wanted pity for Danny. She wanted the honesty of their motives recognized. Bill's life had always been a negotiation with the public, with optics, with the version of himself he liked to present. Naomi wanted him to understand that people were not props in his narrative, and she said so. Bill's response was to laugh sideways and to deny that he had ever mistreated Danny in any real, lasting way. He said the polite things a man says to be exculpated in the eyes of his child, that he cared, that he respected her, that nothing was amiss. Yet Naomi read in his reluctance a nervousness that belied the words. There was a tautness around his mouth, a flicker at the edges of his eyes when she said Danny's name that suggested not the cool certitude of a man who had triumphed in his emotions but the prickly irritation of someone being called to account. Bill was a man who controlled narratives, and Naomi knew he would not happily lose those levers. What no one, perhaps not even Naomi at the outset, intended was the way that Danny's announcement to Bill about an upcoming trip altered atmospheres. Danny, the woman of past intimacies with Bill and present entanglement with Andre, told Bill she would be traveling with Andre. It was a seemingly banal line in their conversation, but it landed like a stone thrown into still water. For Bill, who had never quite learned to manage the small things of emotional life, Danny's mentioning of a journey with another man betrayed a domesticity he might have imagined as a potential future but had never truly attempted. A trip with Andre, even if only a vacation, introduced a new finality to the idea that Danny had options that did not include him. There is a precise human economy to announcements like that. When you tell an ex that you are going away with someone else, you are defining boundaries. You are asserting the life you've constructed and declaring its independence. Danny's trip was not a provocation so much as a boundary, but boundaries inflict conceptual harm on those who think themselves still in the picture. Bill's reaction, quietly uneasy, denying everything outwardly yet shifting inwardly, revealed him as a man who feared, in secret, losing the possibility of being chosen. Naomi recognized the danger in that fear because it was precisely the vulnerability that might push Bill toward a relapse of old desires, of returning to Danny as if their past entitled him to her present. Naomi's intervention thus had layers. It was a guard against Bill's relapse, an act of loyalty to Danny, an attempt to reform the way their family had handled love. She wanted to arch the narrative away from repetition. She wanted to avoid the rehearsal of pain. Yet strategy is a precarious thing. It is both a net and a blade. Naomi's plan could protect Danny. It could also carve into the lives it sought to preserve. In the margins of Naomi's immediate concerns, other people moved, figures whose emotional trajectories would press against the family like tides. The production world around them, too, seemed to be shifting. Gossip columns whispered new names and old missteps. Vernon and Anita, a pairing whose stability had been assumed by many who read the right social pages, were said to be experiencing strain. Producers on the show said the relationship between Vernon and Anita would have some turbulence, which in entertainment parlance can mean any of 100 things: a secret revealed, a betrayal resurfacing, the slow erosion of a marriage's defenses. A rumor implied that Anita had a mistake in her past that she believed had been buried, but the past is a borrower with a long memory. Anita's supposed past mistake became, in Naomi's mind and in the townspeople's talk, a background hum that complicated everything. What if Anita had lied about something that could damage Vernon? What if the mistake was not moral so much as political? An old lobbyist link, a name on a roll of something shameful that could bring disgrace and therefore make Vernon defensive in ways that would ripple into Naomi's father's orbit. Naomi didn't know specifics, but she knew the terrain of scandal. She had seen the way a single blemish could stretch like oil, darkening people who were unconnected to the original stain, and she felt a premonitory dread. If Anita was harboring a secret, then Vernon would be under pressure to shield it, and in sheltering his own family the man might become malleable in ways that would put Naomi's loved ones at risk. This is where casting news starts to feel like an omen. An announcement floated across industry pages: a high-profile performer, known to some as Ridge Forrester from B&B, would be moving into the world of Beyond the Gates. Whether Ridge was arriving as an actor playing himself or as a character with a different name matters less than what he represented: a new force in town whose presence could crack open old relationships. Naomi's imagination supplied all sorts of scenarios: Ridge as an old flame of Anita's, Ridge as the catalyst who could read the past like a ledger and make it public, Ridge as a man who had the sort of charm that dismantled marriages almost by accident. That possibility set Naomi's teeth on edge because she knew how destabilization worked. She knew how one person arriving could tilt balances into fraught new alignments. When you live in a town that prizes appearances, the arrival of a celebrity is the same as throwing a stone into a lake, rippled everywhere. Vernon, as a man with taste for control and image, would feel the tremors of such a cast change in the way his administration, where his politics bled into the personal. If Anita had a mistake in the past and if Ridge knew about it, the actor's arrival could be the wrench that either loosens the lid on a scandal or forces some kind of public hiding. Naomi watched the way Vernon reacted to the world when he was stressed, slight, insular, prone to palliative charm. She feared that his instinct would be to throw weight behind self-protection rather than search for honest repair. That instinct, in the world of politics and performance, often produces more damage than it prevents. Naomi's mind went to the intersection of all these moving parts: Bill's potential relapse, Haley's grief, Danny's flight, Anita's shadow, Vernon's vulnerability, and Ridge's arrival as the literal and symbolic new player. She envisioned alliances, some she fostered, some she feared, that would come together like tectonic plates. She knew that real damage would not occur in a single flash but across many small misalignments that bloomed into catastrophe. That is why she kept maneuvering, why her plan for Haley to lure Bill remained active even as she warned her father. It was contradictory and yet it made a certain perverse kind of sense: draw Bill out, see him fully, let his true politics of the heart be visible so that Danny could choose with eyes open. Naomi's tactics extended beyond the social. They crept into the realms of surveillance and gentle deceit. She arranged for Haley to appear at a fundraiser where Danny was expected to be, not to compete with Danny but to be seen by Bill in a way that implied a life outside him. A life connected and substantive. Naomi's message to Haley: hold him with your marriage, morphed into hold on to yourself, and let your own life be large enough that he cannot quietly insert himself. Naomi recognized, with a clarity that both flattened and relieved her, that you cannot keep a man loyal by jealousy. You keep a man loyal by being a world he cannot possess. The wrinkle was that Naomi wanted Bill to feel a sting, not to be seduced. She wanted him to see what his indecisions did, not to be drawn into a covert romance. It was a precarious masquerade. Naomi watched Bill that night while Haley smiled on the periphery and thought about how many people the world would forgive for a quiet cruelty because he was a man who could produce legible virtues on demand. Bill could go on television and deliver sound bites that pressed the right buttons. He could stand at podiums and make people believe he was the safeguard of family values. But if Naomi's designs worked, they would show that the man who crafted those words also had fragile points that could be probed. The immediate outcome was small and poetically unsatisfying: a private conversation overheard, an exchange that left Bill looking momentarily lost and Dan's face locked into a mask that suggested neither disdain nor forgiveness but fatigue. When Danny mentioned her trip with Andre in such casual terms, a short vacation across the coast to a remote inn, Bill's composure flickered. Naomi watched the flicker and felt both vindicated and afraid. He would not openly declare his jealousy. He was the sort of man who would say good for you and then tilt the world inward until he found purchase. Naomi could see that in him the way a mechanic sees stress lines in a beam. Then the town's gossip condensed into a single, dangerous rumor: Anita's mistake. whatever its substance, was a dossier in someone else's hand. Ridge's arrival had been accompanied by a rumor of his own that he had a history with Anita, that they had known each other before she married Vernon, that their past had been suspended like a file, and the suggestion that Ridge might know the truth made the story combustible. Naomi began to imagine not simply personal consequences but political ones. What would happen if Anita's past was weaponized? Vernon would be forced into defense, and defense in such arenas often looks like recalculation of loyalty. He might distance himself in public from those he believed endangered him in private, or he might double down on secrecy and thereby allow the rot to spread. Naomi's manipulations gained a new urgency because she understood the stakes in this networked way. If Anita's mistake leaked and damaged Vernon, the ripples would come back to touch Bill. Alliances shift quickly when the calculus of scandal and favor is in play. Men like Vernon and Bill had infrastructure campaign managers, PR teams, donors, and those infrastructures protect certain things at the expense of others. Naomi feared that in the adjustments made to preserve image, people like Danny would be used as instruments of damage control, their feelings bracketed and then deployed. That realization hardened Naomi's project into something more than a protective act. It became a mission to arm Danny with knowledge and options so she could choose without being pushed. So Naomi's work multiplied. She briefed Haley not only on being seen but on talking to the right reporters in casual ways that would make Bill question the boundaries of his involvement. She held Danny's hand at events and, when the moment allowed, made subtle inquiries about Andre and the trip. Naomi compiled a map of everyone's movements, not to spy in the prurient sense but to defend. It was all defensive warfare dressed in social garb. She was, in many ways, the least obvious of generals, a young woman who mapped the hearts of older players and thought of battle not in terms of guns but of venue placements and whispered asides. Yet, even as Naomi's plan took shape, there were moments she couldn't control. Bill would be Bill, charismatic, ungovernable in his own way. He would arrive at gatherings in a manner that suggested he had always done things his way, minds unbothered. But he was not immune to the small, corrosive effects Naomi's interventions engineered. He would, on occasion, stand too long in a doorway, eyes sliding over Haley with a look that suggested a history repeating, a rehearsed take that had always been his. Naomi observed him with the clinical attention of someone watching a familiar animal she knew how to irritate. She was, increasingly, aware that to stop a man like Bill you did not argue with him, you made him argue with himself. And the town, that soft stage of gossip and sympathies, watched and murmured. Questions rippled. Why was Haley appearing more in events she had never attended before? Why was Naomi, the picture of controlled youth, suddenly attached to Danny's side like a bodyguard? How did Ridge's arrival relate to Anita's furtive phone calls? These questions added pressure, a background hum of speculation that made the interpersonal maneuvers even more brittle. Naomi felt all this like weather. She was contemptuous of the idea that public opinion should dictate private life, and yet she knew the world they lived in. She knew that if the truth about any of them leaked at the wrong time there would be no clean way to contain the fallout. People would be used as weapons. Reputations would be collateral. She trained herself to move with the quiet efficiency of a person determined to reduce harm on her own terms. Naomi would tip a conversation a certain way at a party, steer Bill's attention toward a topic that made him uncomfortable enough to reveal himself, and be ready with a follow-up that protected the person she loved. Sometimes these interventions produced immediate good, a look of shame, a retraction of a flirtation, Bill withdrawing himself from a situation so that Danny would not have to make a scene. Other times they produced nothing but the sensation of being in a net, trapped in the logistics of intervention with no clean outcome to show for it. Then, just when Naomi thought she had the rhythm down, the town delivered an unexpected blow. Ridge, the newcomer, was rumored to be not just an arrival but an incendiary. He had been contracted to play a role that would bring him in intimate proximity to both Vernon and Anita. Whispers suggested he might portray a character who had a claim on the past. Naomi watched as producers hinted at tension and as the media made the language of scandal into a fog of possibility. The more Ridge's presence insinuated itself into the tapestry of their lives, the more Naomi felt that all her carefully stacked pieces might be swept into ruin by a single performance. The slow burn of Naomi's strategy thus continued, threaded through nights of whispering counsel and days of minimizing harm. She had become an architect of social intrigue, a strategist who believed that if she could coax truth into the light on her own terms she could spare Danny from a repeat of Haley's abandonment. She acted from love, from retribution, and from a peculiar, brittle faith that you could engineer outcomes for the better by manipulating the morally suspect apparatus of desire. She did this because she could not bear the alternative, that people she loved would be left to the whims of men who could not commit. And so the scene lines up, Naomi quietly abetting Haley's visibility, Naomi reminding Haley to hold tight to her husband, Naomi scolding her father for toying with Danny's heart, Danny plotting a simple trip with Andre that is simultaneously a declaration and a test, Vernon and Anita's relationship darkening with the shadow of a secret mistake, Ridge looming as both actor and figurative menace. Each component moves, and the town, like a crowd on a train platform, waits for something to happen, for the carriage to leave, for a stumble, for a collision. The plan is in motion, the players are arranged, and Naomi tucks her hands into her pockets and waits to see which small spark will set the stage on fire. The immediate goals remain mundane enough to prevent heartbreak, to preserve dignity, to keep Danny's autonomy intact, and yet Naomi knows that the simplest aims often require the most complicated means. She feels the world tilt even as she convinces herself she is the one holding it steady. Night falls on the town with the kind of indifferent cloak it always brings. Lights spark in windows, conversations continue, and inside many confident rooms the smallest tremors have already been set into motion, emails sent, texts unsent, a lingering perfume wafted in a place where another's eyes can catch it. Naomi breathes, and in that breath there is resolve. She is determined to see this through, to test the truth of the people she loves and to prevent the repetition of old wounds. What she cannot yet see clearly is how much of their world she will have to break and what she will have to break within herself to make that protection real. The morning after the fundraiser, while fog still clutched the harbor and the town moved with the hesitant grace of people recovering from a night of public performance, Naomi sat in her car and rehearsed conversations. She thought about the meeting she would have with Haley later, about which words to say that sounded like friendship but were in fact ironies of duty. She thought about the way Bill's denial had set his jaw. She thought about Danny's trip, small and ordinary and yet freighted. And she felt that she was standing on the edge of something necessary and terrible. She could not know, then, that the actor who had arrived in town brought with him not simply a talent for performance but a map to many people's pasts. She could not yet know how the threads would pull taut. As the town stirred, Naomi closed her eyes and allowed herself one small moment of unvarnished grief for Haley, for the child who had been taken, and for the way sometimes those who promise to protect are the first to step back. Then she opened her eyes and set about her work with the brutal clarity of someone who believes love is, in the end, a responsibility to be executed.